Hey, I am Mustafa Sharif. Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. We're going to talk about what is a human-friendly traffic. I have the pleasure to welcome my friend and the expert when it comes to traffic and planning and design, Maximilian Bengtsson. Hey, and welcome, Max.
Hello, how are you?
I am fine. How are you doing, Max?
I am fine. There's a lot happening in this town today. That's all I can say right now.
How's it going with working at home?
It's going okay. At first, it was very fun to be at home. It was relaxing. Then it got hectic for a while, and you started to get a bit semi depressed for being home and not meeting your friends. But now it's turned again to being like a more relaxed space, I
Yeah.
feel.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. So, are you ready for the podcast?
I am so ready.
Nice. And thank you so much for giving your time to record this episode.
No worries at all.
So, Max, how would you like to introduce yourself and what are you passionate about?
I would say my name is Maximilian Bengtsson. I work at a company called Sweco with traffic planning. So my passions have mostly been social sustainability and the way that we think about people in the city. And that means basically, for me at least right now, it means how do we operate the traffic space and what is important. The passion has grown like over time, I would say. At first, it was more towards climate, actually, but I realized pretty quickly that infrastructure is a type of climate as well, and that got me really pumped for learning these different modes and how to operate them.
Yes, and I remember when we did the master together, you were really passionate about environmental mobility. So I guess now you combine these two together.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very fun.
Yes, I can imagine that. So how do you define a human-friendly traffic?
I would define human friendly traffic as traffic that we or how we get to the places we want to go, both in a safe way, but also in a healthy way. Um, and that's a bit of the controversy in like, do we want to be effective or do we want to be healthy? Um, and that's what I think is a bit interesting about traffic. You can see nowadays that you go back to the things that worked before, like bikes, for example, instead of going by car, because we realized that when we got put in a car, we also got unhealthy. So we needed to think back and what worked before and why did it work before. And I think we're getting to that place slowly but surely.
So it's basically a kind of we are going back in time and using the old way of transportation.
Yeah, it's kind of like a retrofit for the city, I would say.
Yeah. And when we say human, so what are the different groups that we need to consider when we plan traffic?
There's a lot. Um,
And also,
I
do we need to prioritize a group?
I think in some ways we always prioritize groups, regardless of how we do it. The problem with traffic planning, I think, is that you can't please everyone. Um, and what I mean by that is that sometimes you have two different groups that wants different things of the same thing. The problem with that is that you can't please both of them because they want different of the same. And that is a really big problem for traffic planners because we can say that we work towards equity in traffic planning, but we also neglected some other parts that like don't want to that want other things than that. So it's a bit different, but that's also the challenge with it. A lot of the people talking about traffic planning don't have the answers to everything. Um, and it depends really on what you prioritize in the traffic space.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And what are the groups that we are talking about?
I would say first you have regular people, middle age people. You also have the difference between men and women. It's a very big factor. You have children, is also a big factor, but you also have the people with different disabilities like lowered sight. You have people that can't walk, and all of these need to be able to get forward in the traffic space in a safe way. We for example prioritize differently when we plan things. Sometimes we prioritize the like men and women, for example, so we want to get the more equal city. Sometimes you want to prioritize the people that have sight lowered sight. It comes down to what the area really needs, and that's where the social sustainability thinking comes from, I think. The problem previously with traffic planners, I mean, you've seen it with Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, for example, that you don't listen to the people that are there. You just think that, okay, this is this kind of space, so we need to prioritize this kind of thing. But that might be different if you ask the people that live there.
So it depends on the situation, on the area, which are the groups that you should prioritize.
Yeah, I would say so. And you never know unless you ask them.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're a traffic planner, when you plan an area, do you think that people are going to use this, let's say, traffic from to go from A to B, or this gonna be about a journey, about experience?
I would say it's about the journey. Definitely, like we can tell pretty much from a map like where are the points where people want to go. Like um, at least if it's shorter routes that you fix, like you can see a restaurant, for example, you can see a grocery store. And so on, but there's also homes, there's parks, there's work, there's so many factors that are very necessary to think about. And I would say like most of the things you realize when you just look at the map, but a majority of things you will get from asking the people.
So back again to the point that you need to involve people, to listen to them in order to plan a great traffic that fits to them.
Yeah, exactly.
But we were talking a lot about involving people, community engagement, and this needs a kind of big budget.
Mm.
Do you believe it's possible for small companies, let's say small municipalities with limited budget, to involve people in this kind of project? Because if we're gonna involve people in traffic planning, in public space design, and urban planning and design, architecture, landscape architecture, so I believe this needs a lot of money.
I have a few thoughts about this. One part is that it doesn't necessarily have to cost much more money. It depends on how you do it and how you plan for it. For example, in Sweden we do a lot of child consequence analysis. That's part of how we plan our city in our bigger projects. But the thing is that traditionally half the budget has basically been writing a report, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be done. A report is something that you can have in your system, but I would say that working in the process and being this expert person of how the children feel about like bikeways, for example, you can, if you take away this sum of money that you have for writing a report and you use that for making maps, making illustrations, and actually talking to people, you could get, for one thing, you could get more dialogues. uh, for two, you could be more involved in the process. uh, and three, you also would have better material to present. And that's what I think is important right now, because we have a law now in Sweden from January that says that the child convention, that it's a Swedish law now, and that means that organizations and government need to consider children's perspectives, and you can't consider a child's perspective without asking the child. So you need to do that. It's law. You can't do much about that.
Yeah. So basically, you mean it's need a smart project leader that divide the money into right activities.
Yeah,
instead of
exactly.
putting all the money on writing a report.
Yes, exactly. The report is basically a thing that people read and throw away. And that's the same thing with all reports basically. There's so much stuff you can do with the time that you had for writing a report that's so much more valuable in the long run. Um, and I think we're slowly seeing this shift, but it's going very slow. I feel like, and when I talk to different people, they all agree that we should do things like this, but just don't know how. And that's what I think is interesting about it. We, me and you as consultants, need to come up with that way and give them this this budget with all the good things in it. I think that's very important. So I think it kind of starts with us in that sense because we are the knowledge base.
The municipalities are willing to pay for community engagement and so on, but then it's up to the company that's working with this project.
Yeah, kind of. I think all municipalities, or at least the people in the municipalities that work with these kind of questions, all agree that they want more dialogue. Like no one says no to that, but they also can't pay like 50% more of the budget just to get that, you know? So we need to find a way to do that, but still be able to have the same like system that we have now, but with more like fulfilling results, I think.
Yeah, and also it's interesting you mentioned that writing the child impact assessment, the report,
Mm,
which is about the child perspective. But
mm,
nowadays, we can see that the municipality asking to write it, but without asking children. So how,
yeah.
what do you think about this? I think it's interesting and funny.
It's interesting, but like from my perspective, I see it as dangerous in a way. The dangerous part being that you make assumptions about someone's life. And I think that's a really risky take on things. But that's a classic planning thing. We've always done this through history. We've always decided what people want, right? But we're starting to see this shift, and that's the same with like the protests now and everything. You're starting to see this shift that people matter, and that like thing makes it so that we need to actually ask people what what is it that makes this place so special. And I think it's hard, definitely, and you need a specific competence to actually do that, but it's so necessary. It's so
Yeah,
necessary.
yeah, I can imagine. Even with the previous guests, when I
Mm.
talk to them, I always say that we, like all the past years, we force people to be part of story that maybe they don't want to be part of.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
now finally we started to understand that people should be part of the story that they want to be in.
Mm. Yeah, definitely.
So Max, now I would like to ask you, how do we make it human friendly? So I will give you some of different words and you tell us how what are the elements that we should think about.
Okay.
We can start with the biking. So how do we make it human friendly as much as possible? What should we think about?
Human friendly. I would say bike traffic in itself is sort of human friendly because you see it as taking more time than, for example, car, but you also don't have to go to the gym, so you save time, right? But we don't you don't see that in your you don't think about that in your daily life. So I think like bike traffic usually there was some guy I listened to a couple of years back that said that the problem a lot of the problem in Stockholm today, people always complain about bike riders and so on, and being very angry about it. But if you think about it, if we had the same space for bike as we did for car, that wouldn't be a problem, right? I think it's about prioritization, but I think bike traffic as in of itself is human friendly.
And what should I think about if I want to plan a great bike line?
You should think about that bikes also meet. That's what I would say. It's the most important thing. I would say also bike lanes in in car lanes is not a good idea. It might be like safe on paper, but you don't feel safe biking. You don't. We have some examples here in Stockholm, and I've tried biking on them, and it just doesn't feel safe. Like, it just doesn't. It's hard to explain why, but it just isn't. And I think it has to do with you don't know if a car will do something to get into your lane, and they can always stand there for like leaving goods, and they block the way, and you have to go out in the car lane, and there's a lot of factors that play in. So I would say don't plan bike lanes in car lane or in between car lanes.
So rule number one, separate them.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I would say.
And what do you mean by bikes meet?
So most of the time, when we plan bike lanes, or at least what I've seen in Sweden, is that a lot of them are very narrow, and they're also meant to be a bike lane where you bike in both directions, but you can't meet. We have a great example out here where I live, where they just finished very good bike lanes. But there's so many places in Stockholm where that's not like it's not really optimal.
Yeah. What do you think about the high-speed bike lane, the highway for bike lanes?
I think it's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that you direct prioritization over to bikes, and I think that's a good thing, especially in cities. It might not be applicable out in outside of cities when you're like really far out, but it's very good for getting people to travel into cities without cars. The problem that I see is that it becomes a barrier. You don't stop the fact that it's a barrier, and it might as well be a car lane because it like divides people. So you don't fix the problem in itself, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and that's a bit dangerous.
And is it important to have all these traffic lights for biking people, or do you think they can manage that?
I think it's good in a way, but it can also be managed better. For example, you can direct so bikes have prior on green lights. For example, they've done that in several places, but I think it's also good to have like similar guidelines for biking, because otherwise you make dangerous decisions in traffic. And if you make dangerous decisions, you're not only impacting yourself but also the people around you, and that's a bit dangerous.
Great reflection. Let's move to the next.
Mm.
Ready?
Yeah.
So, walking path. How do you
Yes.
make it human friendly?
It has the same characteristics, I would say, as bike lanes. It's in and of itself human friendly or healthy, at least. We tend to not prioritize the width of the walking path, especially when there's not much space to work with, and that's a big problem. We can see it now with Corona times, right? People supposed to be 2 meters apart, but what if the walking path if is 1 meter wide? Then you can't have 2 meters unless you go out in the car lane. So that's very interesting, and we're seeing like proof of it now. I think it was some traffic planner I listened to on Twitter that mentioned that like how are we supposed to social distance when the traffic system isn't applicable for it. It's a very funny idea, or ironic at least.
Exactly, ironic. And also, I will ask the same question that I did in the beginning. Do you
Mhm.
look at it as the walking path as it's something that linked together point A to B, or it is a point in itself?
I would say it's a point. Definitely. We don't go from A to B as humans. If we find something that's interesting, we will stop by if we have the time, you know? It's very, I wouldn't say naive, but it's very you need to think about that, like if you make a place that's worth stopping by, people will stop by, you know? So we make the places, we make the B, the C, the E, the yeah. We make those places, and if they're not safe, if they're not attractive, people will not go there. There's no reason to go there if you don't need to, right?
Yes, exactly.
I would say a walking path is place, or like it's a walking path from A to B to C to D to E, you know,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
goes on.
So it's not just a link between the different
Mm.
points. It is a point in itself.
Yeah, exactly.
To the hottest topic,
Mm.
cars.
Mm.
Then how do we make cars human friendly?
I can start like if we're just talking in a city center point of view right now, I would say a car friendly traffic is no car traffic. Um, there's no reason to have a car in the inner city. I would say, especially in Stockholm, where there's not that far to get to the different places. I can understand the point where if you live very very far out and you need to go in, but we need to have better alternatives. Electric car is a good example, but electric cars have a problem in and of itself that we don't have the electricity for everyone to go on electric cars. Like we can't charge all of them, um, and that's a problem. I think, but my philosophy has always been that too much of anything is a problem, right? So it's the same. If you eat too much potatoes, it becomes a problem for you. Um, and it's the same with traffic. Like too many cars, it becomes a problem. Too many bikes, it probably also becomes a problem. Too many walking, we would be crowded, you know. But it's a matter of choice. Like if we can direct more people towards public transit and to bikes, it will also decrease the congestion for the car traffic, and we could move the necessary car traffic to electric. That would also lower the CO2 emissions. It's a matter of choice, I think, and you need to like divide it up
Yeah.
for it to be sustainable.
Yeah, and I would like to discuss this with you because you're also into environment and so on. So many people think that the problem with cars and traffic it's about the CO2 emission.
Mm.
So if we get them running by sustainable energy, then it's fine. Is the problem with cars because of CO2 or because of the place that they take in the city?
My biggest problem with cars is neither. My biggest problem with cars is congestion. As I said before, like you can direct people to different modes, and by making those different modes more eco-friendly, we could also reduce the CO2 emissions. But having just electric cars will not fix congestion. We will still be sitting in our cars day in day out if everyone had electric cars, even if they're eco-friendly. It doesn't matter. we
Yeah.
we would still be very unhealthy just sitting there waiting in lines, you know. And that's one of the biggest problems with cars. You say that like, okay, we have more lanes, now we're going to fix the congestion problem, but then more will use cars and we have a congestion problem anyway. Those thoughts are probably most common in North America and so on, but they're very common here, very common. Just recently I had a discussion on Facebook with a person about they were taking away a bus lane in, I think it was Linköping. I think it was Linköping. Um, and saying that it was such a good idea because now they wouldn't have any or congestion anymore when they went into the city. And I was like, the only thing I could say was, wait 5 years and you will have congestion again, because that's the reality. It's a logic thought that more lanes equals less congestion. It's a logic thought that if you widen the road, there will be more space. But the problem is that this answer is not logic, you know. It's or in a sense that way, because it doesn't work that way. More lanes equal more demand, and more demand equal more congestion. That's how it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of simple equation.
Yeah, but like I remember having those thoughts as well before I got into traffic planning, and it's a logic thought to think that way, but it doesn't work in reality, and it's been proven so many times by so many traffic planners, by so many cities, that it doesn't work. So we need to get away from that thought, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And how is it when it comes to public transportation? We can talk about the buses.
I think public transport is a good thing. in many ways. Um, First off, it gives you choice, and it divides you up into having different possibilities to, for example, get to work or get to a park or get to a restaurant and so on. Buses take more people in less space than cars, so it's better than cars. Um, Railways make a lot of people travel very fast. So that's also a good way, and it doesn't really affect the congestion in that way, unless or other than taking away people from cars. But it's interesting, this dynamic between public transit, bike, walking, and cars, because there's so many different opinions. There's so many different opinions still going with the old ways of like building more car lanes. There's still so many opinions that we need to reduce cars, get more public transit. There's so many thoughts about more bike lanes instead. Focus on that. So you have to make your own like opinion. What is best for the people?
Yeah, because now you're telling so many different stories, opinion, and so on. So how do you make the final decision? To whom are you going to listen as a traffic planner?
Exactly, and that's where we come back to our starting point, right? You need to talk to the people living there. It's plain and simple, really. A bus might be a very good option, but if you ask people there, and there's a lot of reasons why buses are unsafe or unequal, um, then it might be better to have a railway there, right? And it might be better to have bike roads so they can bike in instead. Um, it all depends, really. Like you can assume a lot of things, but in the end, it comes down to the people living there. Um, it always does. And
Yeah,
we've seen those things happen as well, like the public spaces that are not used because no one who's supposed to use it want to use it for that purpose that they built it for, right? So
exactly.
yeah,
And also in some municipalities, I find it's a bit frustrating that municipalities have big vision to how to say to empower the public transportation. But when you compare, when you it costs so much to get public transportation card, then you find it very cheap to have a car actually.
yeah,
So there is this kind of, what do you call it, two faces, that in one
yeah,
way you tell, oh, we're going to be super sustainable when it comes to public
yeah.
transportation, all the people should take public transportation, but in reality it costs so much to get on a public transport, so it's
Mm.
easier to have a car.
Exactly, and that's a bit of my point that I made earlier. That in that situation where people are complaining that it costs too much, I might as well get a car. Maybe it's better with bike lanes. They're free, right? You can just take your bike, and like paying a sum for a new bike might be a lot lower than having a monthly public transit card, and you also train on your way to work or to your the place you want to go. And then you don't need a gym membership, for example. There's a lot of things that might be, so that's why it's so important to talk to people. um, like maybe you can have bus stops but no one will use it because it's too expensive, or maybe they try to cheat and get on the bus anyway. That's also a consequence of not thinking about the people living there, right?
Yeah.
Like if they can't afford it, then they can't use it, and then you make it unequal by just planning.
How much do you pay for your monthly public transportation card?
We have a thing with our company that gives us, if you subscribe for a year, you get discount monthly. So I actually think I pay 770, something like that, per month.
Like 70 euros?
Yeah, about
Yeah.
that. But the thing is that after the corona thing, I think I've used public transportation 3 times since mid March to now. It's July or June, um, and I've just gone by bike everywhere. And I'm starting to realize how easy it is, because it takes the same time for me to bike to my work, 25 to 30 minutes, as it did with public transport, 25 to 30 minutes. And I don't have to go to the gym. right?
Yeah.
So you save an hour after work by just going bike,
Yeah,
and it's
very
the same
interesting.
time. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
Mm. And back actually to the point that about community engagement. If we build or if we plan traffic based on people's stories, then it will look different in different areas. So how do you put
Mm.
together the different places of the city to combine it to one whole city? If you understand what I mean, like to
Yeah,
put, yeah,
it's a hard thing to do, definitely. You need to connect everything. Usually, like the bike planners usually, or the ones I talk to at least, usually say that you need a full-fledged system in order for it to work, right? So you can't have, if one area wants bike lanes, you can't just build bike lanes and then stop in the next area. You need to have the full system into the city, and that's a thing you need to think about, like how do we make this so everyone can get from A to B to C to E. Yeah. So it's very hard. It is. Even for the people who worked with bike lanes for 20 years, it's very hard to make these like prioritizations. So sometimes it's just easier to make a specific decision than another. And in the grand scheme of things, it's probably for the better. But when we then remake it, we need to consider talking to people again, just to hear everyone's opinion. And the people that I've talked to, at least in my projects, they aren't like, it's not one side of a coin, you know. They're smart people. They understand that, like, okay, we can't do this, maybe this is better for me then. And then they will make another choice. So if we have a really good bike lane for like several kilometers, and we come to the next place, and they're like, no, bike lanes are not good, we need buses here. And you're saying like, yeah, but we need bike lanes for this to be a complete system. And they would be like, maybe I should go by bike instead, you know. That's the whole thing.
big part of your work is about communication.
That's what we say in my work group all the time. Communication, communication, communication. That's all that matters.
In this podcast, as you know, I'm interested also in finding new points of view about what is a smart city. So today you're a traffic planner.
Mm.
How do you define a smart city from your perspective as a traffic planner?
It's a lot of different sides for me. I think a smart city is a city that gives the people what it wants without the people asking for it. You know, and that's what we see with like effectiveness with the different smart systems, with for example public transit. But I think like having bike lanes, for example, is smart in itself because it makes you train without actually taking the time to plan a training session, and that makes it smart for me, you know. So that's one thing I think. um, I think that a smart city needs to uh, be able to give to the people what they don't know that they want, and that's the hard part as well, I would say. Like, how can you know that? No one knows that. But um, so another part of a smart city is how to make these systems that work in the city work more efficiently. And you see that with like e-trade, for example. How do we make these logistical problems effective in the city? Because they need to get to every place all the time in very short amount of time. How do we do that? Um, I'm definitely not a logistic expert, um, but I would say that's a huge challenge for traffic right now. How do we transition to this system? Um, that's one thing that I think would be able to define a smart city, and also the transition to like electric cars and so on. There's all these technical, but technical solutions don't solve everything. I think that's very important to keep in mind. There's always going to be one or two problems with every system that we invent. Um, and one thing will always create um, something bad on another place, you know. So
Yeah.
it's all about like how do we manage this.
So for you, a smart city is more about a smart mindset, as smart human being that choosing what is a smart.
Hmm,
It's not only about it being smart and from the digital point of view or technical point of view.
exactly. We need to know what people want before they want it.
Do you think AI will take this mission, learning what people need before they ask for it?
I think they can do a lot with AI. It's also something new, and you know what happens with something new. People don't like change. In general, it takes a long time for something new to actually be um, as good as it wants to be. Uh, we saw it with electric cars, for example. It took a long while before from like when people started the hyping electric cars to a system that we have now. Um, and I think that's part of it. It we want it now because the technical systems go so fast, right? Um, just like 20 years ago, I had a really crappy TV at home. Now I have a state of the art TV at home for no money, right? That's very important, I think, um,
Y-
to remember.
Yeah. Do you think now there are many, what do you call them, concept or for city development about the self-driving cars that it's got everything's going to be about sharing cars, so you don't we don't need to have a parking lots in the city, and the cars will drive you, and then meanwhile you're at work or doing something, they will drive someone else, and when you go back home they go and park themselves in the parking pool. Do you think it's a good theory that can be good to implement and is going to work actually?
Both yes and no. I think it's a good system. It's a good like concept. I see very many problems with it though. One problem being prioritization. For the script, what do you prioritize? If you like sooner or later, the system will get in a complicated situation where, for example, you have to prioritize between a kid and an elderly. Which one do you prioritize? And if the script has, I don't know how the scripts work exactly, but the problem can be if you tell the computer to prioritize one thing, it will always prioritize that thing. But all situations aren't like that, and I think that's a big problem that you have in with self-driving cars. It's one thing with self-driving metros and so on, because you don't get these interaction that you get in the traffic space. Uh, so that's I think that's it can be very dangerous. Definitely, definitely. But I also see very many good things about it.
Mm.
But also one thing that I see very dangerous about this is public health, the public health aspect. If we have self-driving cars, everyone will use self-driving cars, right? Like, how easy is it to just hop in the car and it drives you to where you want to go, and then you
I
go out? Like,
I
how?
will be very, very happy to sit in the car without doing, without need to focus on how do I drive, but just like doing something else, you know?
Yeah, and that's the problem, right? That's the problem, because it's so efficient that it makes us lazy, right?
Yeah.
Um, I can really recommend to watch the latest Patriot Act by Hassan Minaj on Netflix, because they talk about supply food chains, and it's something that also makes sense in a way in traffic. I think when you make something like if you make something so effective, uh, or the more effective it gets, the more brittle it gets, which means that if we get to like a pandemic or something, it will collapse, and that's dangerous, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but I think uh, we will get lazy if we come up with these effective systems,
Mm,
and
mm,
that's dangerous, I think, from a public health aspect.
yeah. And by the way, now when you're planning, do you also consider the, what do you call them, the electrical scooters, the self-kicking bikes?
Um, we they're talked about a lot on conferences and so on, but we don't really plan for them. In Sweden, as far as I know, they're considered like bikes, so they should go on bike lanes, right? Um, but the there are so many people who don't and just goes with them anywhere. I know they made some like regulations to it, so it slows down on like public squares and so on. But there's so many problems. They're like they get put in places that hinders people with disabilities, for example, and it becomes a huge problem for walking paths. I think they're good in theory, but I don't think it has worked the way we intended it to work, because most of the people that use them are the younger generation that didn't go by car in the first place, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a big problem, I think.
Mm.
Um, so we need to regulate this in the right way so it doesn't become that kind of problem. But overall, I think they're good.
So Max, if you will plan and draw a smart section of a street,
Mhm.
what are the different function will you have in this?
I would first of all limit the car space as much as possible. There's no reason to have excess space for cars. No reason at all. Um, it all depends on the amount of parking you need or so on. But in the inner city, for me at least, there's no need. Um, of course, you need parking for specific purposes, but um, I don't know why I would need a car if I lived in the inner city. Personally,
Yeah,
there's a lot of people who have really good reasons for having a car. Of course, I don't just see my reason for it.
yeah. So
So
so we start with two lines for buses, not for cars, right? Like,
yeah, they can. It depends on what part you're designing for. Of course, there's a lot of very place specific things that need to be considered. But my prioritization within me, at least, is people with disabilities need to be able to get forward. Walking needs to be safely able to get forward. You need to be able to bike in a safe way. Um, in Sweden, we have when the limit is 30 kilometers per hour, it's okay to bike with cars, because the traffic is so slow, and that when an accident happen, it means that it won't be fatal. You know, it's along with the zero vision that we have in Sweden.
yeah.
Um, so that's the prio I have. It's like walking, people with disabilities, and bikes. Um, but there's so many things that you can factor in. For example, is there a school nearby? Then you need safer routes for kids. Um, is there something that really needs a car to get to close by? Then it's probably better to make those places separated from cars and so on. It depends a lot on what you want to achieve. And I think in the inner city, we should always strive for kids, people with disabilities, and bikes.
Yeah.
I think that's a good prioritization to make in the city. It's a healthy prioritization, and it's also for everyone, I feel like.
Do you think the shared road or street is smart? Like, if you remember the one we had in the front of our university, where like
Mhm.
cars, bikes, pedestrian were all in one road.
My spontaneous thought is no. Um, reason for that is basically that it tend to get very hard to walk for people with lowered sight, because it becomes a very complicated traffic space, which means that you have a tendency to miss to miss where you should go, and then you hear cars in the background, and you don't know where you are, and it just becomes messy. Um, it can work in if it's very if it's designed in a good way, but it's very hard to design it in a good way.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Mm,
Max, if you in the smart city, we will have a machine that you can go back in time.
mm.
So if you will go back in time and you're allowed to change one thing from traffic planning and design point of view, what will you change?
Oof, one thing. Um, I would probably implement the thought that more space for cars does not equal less congestion.
Okay,
I think that's a really important concept to be able to get forward in traffic planning. Um, that's what I think, at least.
yeah,
That concept needs to be more valuable than it is right now. Definitely.
interesting. And if you're allowed to add one more thing, to add a new thing to all the cities, what will you add?
Oof, that's an even harder question. More green space.
More green
More green
spaces.
space. Definitely. There's so many cities who lack green space. There's so many spaces cities. Um, I would say add more green space and make it accessible
Yeah,
for
yeah,
everyone.
yes. Well, it was very inspiring and interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much again, Max.
Thank you.
So how would you like to summarize our talk and also your reflection in three takeaway messages?
I would like to summarize by saying that dialogues with people matter more than you might think. That's the summary, I think. Talking to more people gives you an idea of how the city should be going forward. Bike more, social distance for now, and just walk in the city. There's so many beautiful places that you can see. Just walk around, and just by being home now, I we have been going out and just taking walks, and we've seen so many places that are just beautiful
Yeah,
that I never would have been to if it wasn't for Corona.
explore the city.
Yeah, just explore. There's so many beautiful places.
Nice, nice. Thank you so much again, Max. And now it's time for the three hashtags.
Hashtag cities for people is one. Hashtag everyone, include everyone. Hashtag include everyone. And hashtag green is beautiful.
Nice. Green is always
Mm,
beautiful. Thank you
yes.
so much, Max.
Thank you.
One funny thing I wanted also to ask you.
Mm,
If you remember when we were studying the master sustainable
mm,
urban planning and design in KTH here in Stockholm,
mm-hmm.
many students were proposing ban cars.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
now you became a traffic planner, so tell me, what do you think?
Yeah. I always found the concept very funny. Um, as you said, in our masters, a lot of people uh, always came to the same conclusion, which is take away cars, and and for me that feels like the easy way out. Like, how do we actually do that? We need to be able to get to the places still, even if we ban cars. How do we do that? Um, it's such a funny concept for me, but it makes sense in a way, because if you want to make these beautiful places, you have to take away cars.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
many cases, you have to take away cars. So yeah, that it's very funny, that concept.
Yeah, but also now when I'm talking to people, many of people tell me, okay, just remove cars, remove cars. But theoretical sounds good.
Exactly. but we have built the system to include cars. So we need to have a like complement for taking
Yeah.
away the cars.
Mm.
That's just how it works. Um, and slowly but surely we're getting there. But we can't just instantly take away one thing. It would collapse the whole system.
Yeah.
Like how would police cars get through? How would the ambulances be able to shuttle people to the hospitals? There's so many questions that we have built a system that we, by just taking away that thing, uh, it just crumbles, uh, and that's a problem in itself, right?
Hmm.
So
Yes. Yes. So in 10 years, do you think we will stop talking about this issue? Cars and bank cars, public transportation.
we will never stop talking about that. Never, ever, ever.
Oh,
That's what I think.
that's
It,
annoying.
it will it will be a problem probably uh, as long as we live. I think
Yeah.
in one way or another,
Mm,
we won't
mm.
have the same problems we have today, but we will still have problems.
It's gonna be interesting to see what kinds of problems do we need to solve in the future.
Yeah, yeah,
Again,
I agree.
Max, thank you so much for giving your time. Thank you so much for inspiring us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. Please follow Instagram account and subscribe the YouTube channel. If you have any great story that makes our city smarter, please contact me. Urbanistica podcast is being produced in collaboration with Landskapslaget, working with landscape architecture, urban planning and design based in Stockholm, and also H22 Helsingborg, the making of smart city. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.